Siamo con Scott Turow, vincitore del Raymond Chandler Award, che come tutti i Raymond Chandler Award viene a Courmayeur per il Noir Festival, e Scott Turow si è impegnato, lo ha dimostrato nelle opere che ha scritto, con la punizione suprema, anche sulla questione della pena di morte, che in un paese come l'Italia, dove la pena di morte tra l'altro non esiste, però ha sempre sollevato dibattito e ha suscitato interesse a più riprese. In questo momento l'Italia è impegnata in una moratoria sulla pena di morte e allora la domanda viene spontanea: quali sono le possibilità concrete che si possano diminuire le pene capitali nel mondo, non soltanto negli Stati Uniti?
I really can't comment on what's going to happen in the rest of the world, because the rest of the world really involves China and Japan, and then, of course, the Muslim world, where capital punishment is still practiced. So I don't know what's going on there. I do know that the innocence movement in the United States, in which many persons who were sentenced to death have been proven to be innocent of the crimes for which they were convicted. The innocence movement has had a significant impact on the number of cases in which capital punishment is sought, both in my home state of Illinois and generally around the world. So, I'm sorry, around the country. It's definitely the case that the rate of executions is going down in the U.S. In terms of the Italian moratorium proposal in the UN, of course, I think it's a fine idea, but you have to understand that if Americans really cared about world opinion, they wouldn't practice capital punishment anyway.
Il suo saggio Punizione Suprema è il frutto di riflessioni maturate nel periodo in cui nel 2002 il senatore George Ryan costituì una commissione d'inchiesta sull'applicazione della pena di morte nell'Illinois. In sintesi, lei scrive che la legge, per quanto necessaria, deve ostentare un'affidabilità che non è in grado di dare. La legge non è in grado di risalire alla verità. Al liceo mi avevano insegnato un gioco apparentemente banale ma efficace, per far emergere un paradosso della logica binaria, quella secondo cui le cose sono bianche o sono nere. Prendiamo un foglio, metà bianco e metà nero. Di che colore è la linea che separa il bianco dal nero? La domanda allora è: laddove non arriva la legge, arriva l'arte, la letteratura?
Generally speaking, to speak in the broadest generalities, I think art is at its best, and certainly narrative, whether we're talking about stories or novels or movies or TV, are at its best when it's able to embody ambiguity and contradiction. And so the law, of course, has to be black and white. Either it's against the law or it's not against the law, whatever the particular case is. And as a general theme, my novels have tried to show that the task of the law, while noble, to try to make the world more just, is also hopeless, because our lives as human beings are full of ambiguity and contradiction. Motives are always hard to discover, and even when they're known, they're neither black nor white sometimes. So, the law will always say this is right, but people in the courtroom who listen to this declaration will always mutter this is wrong. And that's basically what I've written about in my novels, to put it in the simplest terms.
E allora come si possono tenere insieme la legge e la letteratura? E poi, e la legge e la verità? Che senso ha giurare con la mano sulla Bibbia?
Well, the truth of the courtroom and the truth of literature are often very different. Just to choose certainly the most famous example that I have written, Presunto innocente, certainly goes to demonstrate that. The courtroom cannot find the truth. The novel gives its own truth. And, you know, I do believe in the process of the legal process to find the truth much of the time. But even when it does, it doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't talk about all of the motives. It doesn't talk about all of the personal history. It doesn't talk about all of the conflicts, because the law has to make it simple in order to fit within its own categories. And so literature generally gives us a much fuller picture of what it means to be a human being than the law does. The law has a rather restricted view of who human beings are and why they do what they do.
A questo punto allora qual è se lei crede che ci sia una funzione di guida civile della società nella letteratura, una funzione civile nella letteratura, senza essere asservita ideologicamente alla politica?
I certainly think that popular literature can. And, you know, I can give you probably maybe the best example in my lifetime is that sometime in the early 1970s, the people who made movies and television shows said to themselves, we are representing a segregated world in the United States. There were no black faces on television. And so they committed themselves to presenting what admittedly in many cases was a highly idealized vision of a world in which white people and black people mingled without the social tension that often characterizes American racial relations. It changed things only minimally for my generation. But for my children's generation, it's a revolution. It's a revolution. My children, my son, for example, had two roommates at Stanford. And when we went, we knew all about the roommates, and he talked about them a lot on the telephone. And one young man was someone he really loved and is still a very close friend of his. The other was someone he hated, and we knew that he regarded this young man as a nouveau riche, a kind of nouveau riche cad. What we didn't know till we arrived was that in each case these young men were black. It doesn't matter to him, and part of the reason it doesn't matter to him is not simply because his parents raised him the right way, but because he grew up in a world where he saw this ideal on television and thought it was not an ideal but normal. And so he and my youngest child also are able to live in a much more equal society, not in general, but in the particular lives that they lead.
Quando si incontra uno scrittore, di solito si ha la pretesa che da lui arrivino risposte su tutte le questioni della vita, della religione, e quindi la tentazione di fare domande che non riguardano la letteratura viene forte. Comunque adesso è appena stato dato il Nobel per la pace ad Al Gore. Al Gore è un ex vicepresidente degli Stati Uniti, e il conferimento di questo premio su tematiche ambientali ci tocca un po' tutti, quindi chiedere a Scott Turow cosa ne pensa ha comunque un senso, anche perché gli Stati Uniti non hanno sottoscritto il protocollo di Kyoto, e quindi cosa pensa Scott Turow di questo riconoscimento ad Al Gore e a chi si impegna sulle tematiche ambientali?
Well, first as to Vice President Gore, I supported him when he ran for president, and it's certainly one of the great disappointments of my lifetime in terms of politics that election turned out the way it did and was decided in the way it was, and I certainly wrote and published about my disappointment. In terms of the what's happened in the United States is that you had an administration dominated by people from the oil industry who did not want to believe that global warming was real. And the truth of the matter is that through efforts like Gore's, and just the fact of what's going on in front of people, Americans know that when people say there is no global warming, that's a lie. They know it's a lie. I live on Lake Michigan. There is no longer an ice cap on Lake Michigan in the winter. The lake is literally evaporating, slowly, but evaporating. The lake level is going down, 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 down. And will Americans support change? In general, sure. When it means that they have to drive smaller cars, or conserve fuel, or do this on their own without, for example, the cooperation of China, I don't know. I think the next political excuse you're going to hear in the United States is, we'll control greenhouse gases when the Chinese control greenhouse gases. But why should we handicap our industries, which are already at a competitive disadvantage with the Chinese, while the Chinese are not paying the price, as it were? So, Americans have not been asked to make sacrifices for 40 years now by their politicians. And so it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out.
In un'intervista che tra l'altro ho pubblicato sul catalogo del Noir in Festival, lei ha scritto che non è mai stato un accanito lettore di misteri, ad eccezione per Sherlock Holmes, e che preferisce la letteratura alta. Premesso che appunto già definire una letteratura alta crea una distinzione per categorie, ovviamente, ma se questa cosa fosse anche possibile, quali sono stati allora i suoi maestri della cosiddetta letteratura alta e non di genere?
Well, first, I don't want to be misunderstood. I have read thoroughly in the great crime writers, Chandler, Hammett, the great writers of suspense, Graham Greene, Le Carré, P.D. James, Elmore Leonard. So I don't mean to create the impression that I don't read crime fiction. My great admiration for the British crime writer Ruth Rendell has been often expressed. But if you want to turn to the high culture world of literature, certainly no American author had an impact on me during my lifetime greater than the one that Saul Bellow had. Now, this was the reasons I largely hid from myself until Bellow died a few years ago. Bellow and my father went to high school together, and even though I knew both men's biographies, I never, ever realized during the time that either Bellow or my father were alive that they had been in the same hallways, probably had marginal contact with one another. But I read Bellow as a sort of literary inspection of really of my father's times and mind, and so there are obviously biographical factors that influenced the impact that these books had on me.